Hello everyone, today we have another CodingBat video called array1 frontPiece. So we're given an integer array of any length and we want to return a new array of its first two elements. So if the array is smaller than length 2, use whatever elements are present. So in this case, we obviously want to return an array of length 2, but that's sort of not true. We want to only return an array of length 2 only if, of course, the array has 2 or more elements. If it doesn't, then we don't want to return an array of length 2. I'll show you why. So suppose we said, okay, I want to return an array of length 2, and so I'm going to call this new array equals, let's say, new int of length 2, because we're assuming that we want to return a new array of its first 2 elements. So this is tricky because it's implying that there's always going to be 2 elements, but that's not true. So we say we were going to return a new array of its first 2 elements, and so we say, okay, I at least need an array of length 2, right? And then I go ahead and say, all right, well, I'm just going to keep solving the question here. So if nums.length, if nums.length is essentially greater than or equal to 2, then I know that we have at least 2 elements in the array, in which case I want to, well, okay, let's think about this naturally here, intuitively, what one would do. What one would do is they would say, okay, well, what I would want is I would want to take my new array at index 0, which references the first element in the array, and I want to set that to the first element in num's array. I want the first 2 elements, right? So I'm taking the first index of both of them, which is actually just the 0th index, and I'm equating them to one another. In other words, actually, I'm not equating them one to another. I'm equating new array's first index, which is empty, to num's first index, which is actually filled. So whatever was inside nums is actually going to be inside new array. And then I say, okay, well, I want the first 2 elements. I don't want the first only. I want the first 2. And so I say, okay, well, I'm going to have 2 here. So I'm going to actually take the next element, which is of course empty in new array, because recall that we actually have when we form new array. When new array is formed, it has these 2 boxes, and by default inside we have these 2 zeros in these boxes by default, even if they're not initialized or if they don't have values yet. Now, as we do the first line, it actually populates the first box to something other than 0. But as we move on to the second line here, we can say, okay, well, nums, the first index, which actually refers to the second element in the new array, is actually going to be populated with the second element in the nums array, which is of course referencing the second element at the first index. It's okay, that's perfectly fine. But of course, if we return this, and let me actually just have that here, just sort of blanked out. But the problem is, if we return this, we're gonna get some problems. So if I say return new array, you can see here that that I get a lot of problems. Some of them I do get what I want, but I get a lot of array out of bounds index errors, because this sort of implies that there are 2 elements, but there aren't always 2 elements. You'll see here that we have 1 element. You'll see here that we have 1 element here. And this, of course, you're forcing the program to go to nums of 1. Nums of 1 may not even exist. It may not have 2 elements. And so we only want to do this if nums.length is greater than 2. We only want to do all of this if nums.length is greater than 2. But the problem here is, okay, if I were to do this, then what would happen? Well, suppose that if it's greater than 2, then it works. But what if it's equal to 2? Then it just doesn't work. So we also want to ensure that it's equal to 2, greater than or equal to 2. And so in that case, we would have, what didn't work before is now working. So we also want to do this if it's greater than or equal to 2, not just if it's greater than, right? But then of course we get another problem. And the other problem is this, that we've taken into account if the array was greater than or equal to 2. In other words, these test cases work perfectly fine. because all of them satisfy that. But you come to another problem. You say, well, it seems like we haven't taken into account two other details. The first detail is if suppose the array itself was empty. Suppose there were no arrays at all. I mean, there were no elements in the array at all. In other words, the array that we wanted to, the array nums just had nothing in it. What would we do then? Well, the thought could be to do nothing, right? You could say, well, okay, I'm just not going to do anything at all. I'm going to say, okay, well, I'm going to say if it's greater than or equal to 2, then do this. Otherwise, and this otherwise is going to essentially take into account if nums.length is equal to 1, then do something. Or otherwise, if nums.length is equal to 2, or sorry, is equal to 0, then do something. So if it's equal to 1, then essentially what I want to do is I want to say, okay, new array at the first index, at the first element referenced by the first index is essentially going to be nums of 0. Because we know that the length of the array is 1, and if the length of the array is 1, we have at least one element in the array. And if we have at least one element in the array, that one element is being referenced by the 0th index. There's only one element. So there's only one index, and that index is the first index, which is 0. And then we think, well, if it's equal to 0, then we don't want to do anything at all. So why have this else if in the first place? There are no elements, which means I don't want to populate new array with anything. And so I say, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to populate new array with anything at all. And then I click go. And it solves some of my problems, but not all of my problems. Why is that? Well, there's a good reason behind it, and I actually want to show you here. I have this open in Python Tutor here. If you visualize the execution for this code, then you'll see that when we have one element, we're not just grabbing. So you would think that when we're in our CodingBat problem, oops, this one, when we are in our CodingBat problem, you would think that we're taking the first element of new array and just giving it to that one element, but that's wrong. We're not returning only that one element. We also have tacked on a 0, and we've tacked on a 0 because new array by default is length 2. And if it's length 2, then we have 2 boxes, and there are default, those 2 boxes are defaulted to 0. They have 0, 0 as their values. So yes, we grab the first element of nums. But do we in fact only return nums? No, we don't. We actually tack on another 0. And so that doesn't represent what we want to return. So the goal here is either have no length at all, or if nums.length is equal to 0, just return nums as it is, right? And you'll see that, just return nums as it is. And you'll see that does some things, but of course here we're getting another error, which is of course if nums.length is equal to 0, then we just want to return the nums because there's nothing inside it. And so you see here that works. So essentially you're taking into account if nums.length is equal to 1 or num.length is equal to 0. You're returning nums in both cases, so why not just return nums all together? That works perfectly fine.